Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to look at a single photo taken by Neal Beidleman to see what it tells us about the 1996 Everest disaster. The photo appears on page 11 of Into Thin Air, the illustrated edition, and I claim fair use for that photo. Beidleman was one of the guides on Scott Fischer's Mountain Madness team, and as Jon Krakauer was asleep during the entire time the Mountain Madness team was stranded in the storm, he largely uses Beidleman's account for what happened. As a bit of trivia, on my 2018 search for Andrew Irvin on the north side of the mountain, Beidleman was also climbing. Our search was on the upper mountain on May 19th, and Beidleman summited on May 20th, so we would likely have crossed paths at some point, but I do not recall ever interacting with him. The events of the 1996 Everest disaster have been told by various authors, and previously I was critical of Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air because it failed to mention that the Mountain Madness clients received 4 oxygen bottles, while the adventure consultants received only 3 for the summit bids. Krakauer also ignored the stunt that Scott Fischer and his lead Sherpa, Lobsang, were planning on the summit. Another major event left out by Krakauer was the theft of gear that had happened earlier in the expedition. Although this did not play a major role in the events of May 10th or 11th, it was a rather significant event, and it is not clear why Krakauer chose to leave it out, other than that it didn't contribute to his narrative that inexperienced climbers were the cause of all evils on Mount Everest. But from this, it should be apparent that significant events from the 1996 expedition were left out of Krakauer's book, nor do they appear in Bucrave's book, The Climb. Each of those authors had a narrative they were pushing, and they just ignore things that don't fit their version. But any author needs to leave out some details. Krakauer could not include every detail about where the oxygen bottles were cached, how many were there, etc. And while I think facts such as those are important, clearly Krakauer was more focused on the important details of coffee pots in base camp. But aside from leaving items out that I happen to find important, did Krakauer report items that can be verified to be factually inaccurate? It turns out, yes. In the book Into Thin Air, the illustrated edition, Krakauer includes hundreds of photographs. Using those photographs, much of the climb can be reconstructed up to the point of the storm, after which there are no photos. And while I will not get into them in this video, one set of photos that provide substantial insight into the climb are the photos from Scott Fischer. After Fischer died, his camera was recovered, and many of the photos appear in the illustrated edition. Not only do the photos not support what Krakauer wrote, some of them directly contradict it. This video is going to look at one such photo and look at how Krakauer misused his source to present the narrative he wanted. That is, I will not be blaming Beidleman. One account of what Beidleman said appears in Krakauer's Into Thin Air. A different version appears in Bucrave's The Climb. The photo makes the account of Into Thin Air impossible. It is not clear what Beidleman told to Krakauer, nor why Krakauer could not immediately see the problem with the version Krakauer used, though clearly that version supported Krakauer's narrative that Sandy Pitman was the root of all evils on the mountain. I will also point out that Krakauer did the same thing with Lobsang. Lobsang had at one point told Krakauer that when he came upon a debilitated Scott Fischer, Fischer started acting crazy and saying he was going to jump off the mountain. Lobsang later wrote to Krakauer saying that he was misunderstood. Lobsang's version was that he had told Fischer that he would stay with Fischer and either save him or die himself. At that point, Fischer stated he would jump to his death, thus allowing Lobsang to descend. Faced with that decision, Lobsang left Fischer. Lobsang also corrected the altitude at which he caught up with Fischer and explained that because Lobsang's ice axe was being used to fix a portion of the rope to the summit, he remained behind until after Rob Hall and Doug Hansen had descended. Although Krakauer does respond to some items in Lobsang's letter, the issue was never corrected in Krakauer's book, and Into Thin Air still does not credit Lobsang for dragging Fischer down from the south summit, because dragging an experienced guide down from the south summit does not fit Krakauer's narrative that only inexperienced climbers need to be dragged down. Whether Beidleman or others made similar such corrections, which Krakauer also similarly ignored, I have no idea. Returning to the photo, the caption states it was taken at 3:20 and shows Doug Hansen ascending and Sandy Pitman descending. In the distance on South Summit is Bucrave, but I will not be analyzing his movements in this video. The time reported for the photo was 3:20, and that appears to largely be accurate and correspond to where Doug Hansen was on the mountain at that time. Hansen was reported on the summit a little after 4 p.m., so he is 40 minutes below the summit. That is 40 minutes at his extremely slow pace. But we need to pinpoint this location on the mountain, and it'll be worth spending a little time on this section of the ridge because it will be used later in a video analyzing what Krakauer claims he personally did on the climb. Switching over to the DJI drone photo, this cornice here matches up with the one Hansen is next to. So Beidleman is here, he's the one that took the picture, and Pitman is about 60 feet further down. You can see Hansen is clipped into the fixed rope, and the rope extends over to the left. This string is not a fixed rope, it is a bootlace coming off of Hansen's boot. The Hillary step is just the other side of that snow slope Pitman is on, and about 70 feet in front of her. Switching over to this DJI photo, you can see the rock formations that make up the Hillary step, or at least what is left of it. And you can see on this Google Earth satellite photo those same rock formations, and that allows us to measure the straight line distance from the top of the Hillary step to the summit, and that is about 840 feet. Beidleman is about 130 feet from the top of the Hillary step. While the horizontal distance is 840 feet, the vertical distance is 213 vertical feet, or 65 vertical meters, from the top of the Hillary step. In Krakauer's book, he claims to have climbed from the bottom of the Hillary step to the summit in less than 12 minutes for a whopping 1,260 vertical feet per hour along the final summit ridge. So either Krakauer climbed that section 4 times faster than some of the best climbers in the world, or he is inventing his climb times to push his narrative. I'll get into Krakauer's manipulation of his climb times in a future video, but if you are reading into thin air and wondering why the climb times don't make any sense, it is because the climb times don't make any sense. A very solid climber, such as Dave Hahn, would make 350 vertical feet per hour over that section, and Krakauer is no Dave Hahn, but we can set that as an upper bound for the people climbing on May 10th, 1996. As a note, for Krakauer's first 1,600 vertical feet, that was done at 314 vertical feet per hour with all his breaks subtracted out. I simply do not believe that Krakauer clocked in at 1,260 vertical feet per hour on the summit ridge. But he needed to fudge his time to make his narrative work, so that is what he did. Fortunately, there is a photo showing he was nowhere near where he said he was at that time, and we will be able to fill in what actually happened in a future video. Back to the summit ridge above the Hillary step, climbing at 350 vertical feet per hour requires 36 minutes to make the summit. Doug Hansen took over 1 hour and 15 minutes, and Scott Fisher about 1 hour and 5 minutes. Descending, you are going to take about half as long as the ascent. So for an average climber, maybe 50 minutes up and 25 minutes down. Now, let's look at what Krakauer wrote. At 3:10 Friday afternoon, Fisher still hadn't arrived on top, says Beidleman, adding, I decided it was time to get the hell out of there, even though Scott hadn't showed up yet. He gathered up Pitman, Gamelgard, Fox, and Madsen and started leading them down the summit ridge. So 10 minutes before this photo was taken, Beidleman reports gathering the group together and leading them down the mountain. Krakauer reports the following. Beidleman's primary concern at that time was Pitman. Everybody was pretty messed up by that point, but Sandy looked especially shaky. I thought that if I didn't keep real close tabs on her, there was a good chance she'd peel right off the ridge. So I made sure she was clipped into the fixed line, and in the places where there was no rope, I grabbed her harness from behind and kept a tight hold on her until she could clip into the next section of rope. She was so out of it, I am not even sure she knew I was there. It is not clear how Beidleman could have been leading Pitman and the others down from the summit while Pitman is by herself roughly 50 feet in front of Beidleman. Beidleman is not grabbing her by the harness in that photo, and it does not appear she is clipped into the fixed rope. Either she or Doug Hansen would have had to unclip to pass each other, and Beidleman was not close enough to grab her by the harness for that maneuver. It appears that none of the statements that Beidleman made in Into Thin Air are correct. He did not lead the group down from the summit, he did not focus on Pitman, and he certainly was not grabbing her by the harness in that photo. Nor is there any explanation how to taking a photograph was somehow focusing on Pitman's safety. I don't blame Beidleman for any of this. As I will get into later, this account he provided to Krakauer looks like it was just confused for a nearly identical account Beidleman provided for the events below the South Summit, And it appears Beidleman was just confusing the two incidents, and Krakauer should have spotted that in the months he was working on the book. Now, to be sure, Pitman was in trouble and would need help getting down the mountain, as would Jasko Namba, Doug Hansen, Scott Fisher, Beck Weathers, and even Jon Krakauer. In fact, about 15 minutes before this photo was taken, Krakauer reported he was out of oxygen and incapacitated, unable to descend until a guide came by and gave him more oxygen. As for Pitman, so you have to take that information that Pitman was clearly in trouble and see if it fits into the timeline invented by Krakauer. He says Pitman left the summit at 3:10 with Beidleman and then is all the way down here by 3:20. While certainly possible for a fit climber, Pitman was not fit, nor was Beidleman grabbing her by the harness and pulling her down. There's not a remote possibility Pitman descended from the summit to that location in just 10 minutes. Most likely, Pitman left the summit far earlier than 3:10, probably 15 minutes earlier. Most likely, she left alone because she is still alone in this photo. I don't think there are any climbers hiding behind Doug Hansen. It took her 25 minutes to descend to her location, just as it will take Doug Hansen more than 40 minutes to reach the summit from his position. There is simply no way Pitman made it from the summit to this location in the 10 minutes of Krakauer's version. Now, Beidleman took this photograph, and Krakauer should have spotted this problem, as there is no way Pitman could be that far away from Beidleman if he was assisting her down the entire time. In Buchrev's book, The Climb, the story is different. In a group discussion that was recorded, Tim Madsen states that he, Charlotte, and Beidleman left the summit at the same time. In her book, Gamelgard claims she left the summit after the others had already left. The Climb does have a footnote stating that Beidleman later changed the story to the 3:10 group descent. Beidleman then describes that once they reached the Hillary Step, he and Pitman had to untangle some ropes, and that Pitman then rappelled down. At that point, Beidleman says he looked up the summit ridge and noticed the others descending just fine. While Beidleman's account in The Climb would be consistent with the photo, as he only stated he caught up with Pitman at the Hillary Step, it indicates that Pitman was not doing nearly as poorly as the account in Into Thin Air. Pitman was clearly in front of Beidleman in the photo, and then according to Beidleman, she had time to rappel down the Hillary Step, and the other Mountain Madness climbers were still above descending. This is not consistent with a debilitated Pitman leaving at the same time as everyone else. Instead, it is consistent with Pitman leaving ahead of everyone else and Beidleman catching up with her at the top of the Hillary Step, just as the photo indicates he would if he was descending slightly faster than her. One problem is that Beidleman reached the summit at 1:25. According to his own timeline, he stayed on the summit for an hour and 45 minutes. Given that it appears Pitman headed down earlier without him, this leaves the problem of why he felt the need to remain so long on the summit. Similarly, Lopsang reached the summit at 2:10 and remained until 4 p.m., a total of 1 hour and 50 minutes, and Lopsang was without oxygen the entire time. It appears the Mountain Madness guides remained on the summit waiting for Scott Fisher so they could pull their stunt. Lena Gamelgard directly says that is what Lopsang was doing. Krakauer never mentions any stunt and never provides any reason why the Mountain Madness guides remained on the summit so long. It doesn't fit his narrative that inexperienced climbers were the problem rather than arrogant guides who wanted to play a stunt on the summit. However, using this photo, it appears the account in The Climb is more accurate and that Sandy Pitman left the summit first, then Beidleman, Fox, and Martin headed down as a group, and Beidleman did not catch up with Pitman until the top of the Hillary Step. Gamelgard left after everyone else, as she stated in her book, and would not catch up until later. After South Summit, the accounts all agree that Beidleman grabbed Pitman by the harness and slid her down the mountain. That account is both in Into Thin Air and confirmed by Pitman in the interview in The Climb. After sliding down the mountain a little ways, Beidleman reports she is doing better and turns her oxygen down a little. It is then what happens after this that creates the rift between Pitman and Beidleman, and I will cover that in a future video, but that relates to Beidleman's decision to take the group off route on their descent. Looking at Beidleman's account in The Climb, I'm going to skip some sections, but you can pause the video and read what I leave out. Anyway, I don't quite remember where I was, somewhere around the South Summit in the last tape. The focus that I had at that particular point was on Sandy. He then goes on to say that when he came up on Pitman, she was receiving the shot of Dex. The two things that were important: number one, I realized that we had to motivate pretty heavily on Sandy. I got in front of her, clipped on the rope. This was at the point where if you go out skier's left, if you will, you can slide down the fixed rope. I grabbed Sandy's harness and started her down and told her a process that I had used many times before, pretty successfully, which was that I would start her down, I would slide down the rope on my butt, somewhere between 10 to 50 feet, depending on the steepness of the hill, and then she was just to basically slide on her butt, out of control if necessary. The snow that she built up in her feet against my back would stop her, and we could start over. Apparently, Beidleman had used this technique numerous times as a ski guide, but it seems clear that his account of what happened below South Summit just got confused with his account from the actual summit. In any case, the account of the descent of the summit ridge in into thin air is contradicted by the photograph. It appears that Beidleman simply confused two events from an extremely traumatic day in which he was hypoxic and fighting for his life and those of his clients. However, this gives us some insight into the MO of Krakauer. He does this throughout the book. He gets multiple different versions of a story and then runs with the one that fits his narrative, even though it is simply not true. In the end, he just hides behind his statements that he accurately quoted the source. Curiously, in an interview in Outside Magazine, Krakauer states, "The unreliability of memory among Everest survivors, clients, and guides alike is something I find strange and fascinating and quite disturbing. While comparing multiple interviews that various subjects gave me and other journalists, I discovered that the recollections of some of us have changed dramatically with the passage of time." And yet Krakauer does nothing about this in his book, quoting what any reasonable person would know is a mistaken account and passing it off as the truth. And while it is fine to give someone the benefit of the doubt, Krakauer's falsification of his climb time and the use of the Summit Ridge story that he should have known was inaccurate remove that benefit for him. And as soon as you know that Krakauer is just inventing things to tell a story, his whole book makes sense. I will get into more of the major inventions of Krakauer in upcoming videos, and then get into what really happened and why Krakauer could never tell the real story.